Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our next Livestock Guardian Dog webinar in the series. I do want to thank the Sheep and Goat Predator Management Board for making my position possible here at the AgriLife Center. Dr. Redden, our director of the center, and then Robert Pritz for helping us with the Zoom webinar as always. Our sponsor today is Lone Star Tracking. If you guys have any GPS tracking needs, feel free to contact Lone Star Tracking and ask for Thomas Remart. He'll get you taken care of. He works with us on GPS trackers for our livestock guardian dogs. One quick housekeeping thing. If you have any questions, please post those to the chat room. We'll get all the questions answered at the end of the program today. With us presenting today is Dr. John Tomczyk. He received his PhD in wildlife management from Texas A&M University. He's a native of Central Texas and grew up in a ranching family. His research and extension work focuses on the management of wildlife damage and disease. This includes both lethal and non-lethal methods of managing predators, feral hogs, and predatory birds. He also works to manage wildlife diseases and help coordinate community-level programs to teach landowners to self-manage their damage problems. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Tomczyk. Thank you very much for presenting again today for us.
Well, you bet, Bill. I appreciate being invited and appreciate everybody's attention and time this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to get to come and talk on this topic. And again, as Bill said, if you've got questions, by all means, please put them in the chat window. We will be sure to get to absolutely all of them. And again, I appreciate Bill and Reed and Robert and everybody else for allowing me to be here and visit with you. So what I'm going to talk about today, because I believe we ought to teach you by experience and teach you based on things that we went out and studied. I'm going to talk about the performance issues and performance items that we saw from some livestock guardian dogs on the A&M Martin Ranch between Menard and Junction, Texas. And again, this photo, like many of my photos, was taken there on the ranch. So it's one of those topics where when I came in and worked at the center there in Angelo before I moved a little bit further east, the question was posed, well, what do the dogs actually do out there in the environment and how do the predators react to it? We know that dogs can be an effective tool. We've known that forever, and many of you know that firsthand. But for us as scientists, and for me as a person that's a scientist on wildlife damage, I really wanted to kind of take the hood off and understand what's going on under the hood, behind the scenes, and how the dogs actually do their jobs and how they respond on the landscape. And this one's pretty important. So forgive me as I'm trying to get my screen to change. There we go. So we had a project that lasted for a few years, and we intensively tracked the guardian dogs there on the Martin Ranch, which I point out at that time, the dogs were already very successful. So I came in midstream. I am not in any way to thank for the dogs being good at what they did. I arrived and the dogs were already making a big difference. And this was something that Dr. Walker, the previous center director, had mentioned to me. Dr. Redden and I weren't very long at the center when we both started working on these items. And again, being a person that works on damage management, you hear pretty often, oh, guardian dogs. Well, they're this and they're that. A lot of things I heard. Guardian dogs are an ideal non-lethal management tool. They can cut down on predation by, whatever, X percent. And people had that experience. Or they'd say, guardian dogs, it's a tool that works 24 hours a day and this and that. Or people would say things like, guardian dogs are great, but you need to train them. You need to work with them. Not every dog works in every place. And all those things are true. From a wildlife scientist standpoint, ecologically, they make sense to us because guardian dogs, at least where we live, seem to fill a niche that used to be occupied by wolves. So if you've heard me talk before about guardian dogs especially, I would talk about they are the wolf that works for you because your predators have no idea that we don't have wolves living here anymore. It's been an awful long time. We used to have wolves in our environment. The other predators don't know it. The reality is things like coyotes are intensively preyed upon by wolves in areas where they both exist. So if you were to work with sheep raisers in the Intermountain West, they might know or they might not be aware that a number of their coyotes get killed every year by the wolves that are up there. It's an interesting dynamic, and folks in Texas say, John, that's great and all, I don't want wolves. But the dogs fill that role, and in theory, they could help push some of those predators away from the flock because those animals don't want to be anywhere near a dog. It looks like something that's going to eat them. So that makes sense. And we all sat around and said, yeah, no, that kind of makes sense. That might explain why they're good at what they do. But we needed data. Because we're extension, we always have to have data to recommend a tool to you to use. And so we wanted to go out in the field and ask some questions on this project about how good dogs that are already doing a good job, what is it about them? What do they do? How do they behave? And unlock some of those questions. So we wanted to know what the effect of the dogs was on the activity of those predators, on the way those predators set up territories, and on how close they would get to the dogs and to the livestock, and honestly, how close the dogs stay to the stock. We were able to ask those questions. So that was what we wanted to know. What effect do the dogs actually have in a system where we already know they work well, and the landowner, the livestock raiser, in this case, the experiment center, is happy with the performance they're getting on the dogs? So make a long story short, we had a few basic questions. We did want to look at dog behavior while we were already there, and in things that make a big difference, right? What territory do the dogs set up? They're canines too, and they're going to run some period in some amount of space, and we want to know what space they're using. We also wanted to know that question that every person that has dogs and has a neighbor that has dogs seems to ask, which is, how do they interact with fences? Can you manage them with fences? Do they wander? What do they do? We also wanted to know, on the wandering question, whether or not they would actually stay with the livestock if they had just a few select ones they really liked, or if they didn't. They just sat tight and did what they needed to do. We didn't know. We were able to ask that question. Coyote behavior was something we really wanted to know a lot more about, which is, how do the coyotes actually respond to the dogs being there? Now, I think it's important to know, and I'm going to reiterate this several times, as far as things go, this is a pretty low coyote density area. And maybe that's thanks to the dogs, and maybe that's just thanks to a history of management. But there aren't a whole lot of coyotes out in that area, but we wanted to know how they're responding, because that's the chief predation concern for livestock raisers. And we wanted to know the guardian dog's effect on other wildlife, both those other predators in the environment, but also things like deer and turkeys that people care a lot about. So those were our basic questions. Before I present data and results and get you into that, a few things that I think is important to understand is how we went about collecting all of that data. So again, as a wildlife scientist, nowadays it seems like we put GPS collars on just about everything we can shake a stick at. We're good at it. So we put GPS transmitters on the guardian dogs themselves. This is one of the dogs getting its first GPS collar ever put on, and boy, doesn't it look excited about it. But I'll also point out a credit to my friends there at the center. Those dogs were very easy when we needed to handle them and needed to put on collars or change collars out. I'm not sure they were happy about it, but they responded well to it, and they let us do our job without being too persnickety. And that's due to a history of managing that dog well. So we also put transmitters on the sheep and goats there at the property. They interacted with the collars on the dogs. So basically it was a little UHF radio that the dog's collar would listen for, and it would log when it encountered that radio and how close it was. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but that's how we figure out how close they're staying with the livestock. We looked on the landscape. We put out a series of cameras, and then we also collected predator scat from the roads. And I know what y'all are thinking, wow, wildlife people are a little strange. They walk the roads and pick up poop. That's true. But we did that to determine the activity levels of the predators in the environment where the dogs were, and we overlaid the dogs' locations with that data. We also just looked at things like how the landscape changed in terms of habitat, tree cover, you name it, topography, and things about the ranch, fences, water, working areas, that kind of thing. And we analyzed basically how tight do the dogs stay to where they are put, and do they stay with the livestock that they're supposed to, that charge fidelity, right? You're charged with taking care of the sheep. Do you actually stay with the sheep or the goats, and how closely do you stay with them? And we also wanted to know what the influence of feed and water was. How does where we put food and water on this property affect what the dogs do and don't do? Can we see an effect, right? And that would show up in something like the dogs will not go X number of miles away from the water, or they will not leave a feed site because they're protecting it. And there are a number of things that are good about the way the dog management on the ranch was set up, but I'll talk about that a little bit in detail, and I'm sure Bill can go into a lot more depth, or Dr. Redden can, at some point, about how they manage dogs there. My role was just to see how the dogs interact with predators in the environment. And just to give you a little bit of an idea what that data actually looks like. So when we put those collars out and we allow them to collect data, what we end up having is a number of dots on the map. And I'm not going to show you in this case all 3 years worth of data because it would just look like a solid block of dots. But this is representative of what we saw across time. So the grad students I had working on this project had a tendency to name the dogs. And so you're going to see that at the bottom. This was a female they named Elizabeth, and then they named others things like Alfred and Nigel because they felt very much like they were British butlers that took good care of the charges that they served. I thought it was funny, but again, just bear in mind that's what you're looking at. So when you look at these locations here, this is the ranch outlined in yellow. You can see what the perimeter is, and there is a road that passes through it on the eastern side of the ranch. You can see that. And there are yellow interior fences as well. Now, all of these fences are of the same type and quality. They're net wire fences, just typical sheep and goat fences. We're not talking high fence or anything like that. One thing I want to point out to you that anybody can see just looking at these images is that the dogs tended to stay, or this dog tended to stay in the primary pasture that it was put with the sheep that it was charged with. Now you see a few areas in that pasture where it seems like a bigger concentration of dots, and those tend to be where the water and food sources are, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you can also see that there are some dots spread out in other pastures. And essentially what this boils down to is there were times when there were livestock in other pastures that were lambing or kidding, and those dogs left where they were with their flock and moved down there to attend those animals during lambing or kidding times. Again, same property, but different group that the dogs did not tend to spend most of their time with. So I'm going to show you a few images of these dogs and talk through them. And then I'm going to point out some interesting things that you can see just plain as daylight looking at locations from your dogs. So in this case, this female tended to stay there. This male that tended to spend most of his time with her, they ran much as a pair. So if you look at their locations over time, if we were to look every hour on the hour, you would see that many of those locations are identical because those dogs tend to be with one another, just how it worked out. Same kind of pattern you see here. This dog goes a few more places than this one does. You'll see he bends out to that central eastern pasture, but again, tends to stay with the charges he was put with and made some movements when lambing and kidding was going on. And the way we know this is that we had boundaries set up. We knew the dog was in that primary pasture. We set up a boundary and we got a text message when the dog left that boundary. And basically the students would go out and investigate where the dog was and what he was doing. In most of those cases, you would see the dog laid down next to a nanny or a ewe that was kidding or lambing at the time. And so it's our ability to check, okay, he's moving. Why is he moving? And how does he move on the landscape? Now, this third dog that you're looking at has somewhat similar behavior. He would spend some time with the other two, or at least in the same pastures, but he moves a lot more. And I think the thing that we need to pull out of this is that, yes, there were multiple dogs working the same flock, but they spread themselves out in this case. So yes, they're moving between all of the livestock, but they aren't always together. What I do want to point out to you is that in these cases, their locations are very tight against the fences, the perimeter fences, but we rarely have an instance of dogs leaving the pasture that they're put in. Now, you're going to notice that that far southeastern pasture, at some point, the dogs are all over there. And I will point out to you that that was a time that stock were moved in a rotational system across the road, and the dogs went with them. So they stayed with their charges. That's good. That's what we want to see. Even without complex analysis or anything like that, we are seeing evidence that the dogs are staying where they should. Now, you're going to notice, and you'd be right to point this out to me, that there are some locations that are off the property. You can see that on the far southeastern side. Now, when the dogs leave the property, our collars would go into overdrive, and they would say, hey, we're not on the ranch. We're not on the ranch. And they would tell us on a very fine scale every minute or so where they were. So I can tell you that in these dates, in this period of time, these animals left the ranch. They departed on the 16th, or excuse me, on the 1st of August, 2016 at 2 in the morning, and they returned the next night, or that same night, between 8 and 11 p.m. Turned out what's going on with this, the dogs had gotten on the neighbors, whether through something down on the fence line or whether through a gate that was left open, but they did not go very far and they returned. Was it another issue? Were they chasing a predator? Who knows? I do not know, and I was not there to figure it out. But they did not spend an inordinate amount of time off the ranch. They did go home into their charges. They weren't very far. Now, again, we can all sit and argue about whether that should or shouldn't have happened. The reality is, without more than one or two exceptions, the dogs didn't leave the property. They're fully capable of it. What I want to point out, these yellow interior fences here, the dogs are fully capable of going between pastures. How do they do it? They climb the fence. They go right over it. So there's nothing stopping them from leaving the pastures other than their desire not to. And I cannot emphasize that enough. These are dogs that were doing their job, and we found evidence of successful bonding by watching what they did. Now, I want to talk about one last dog before I talk about the fidelity of those animals to their charges. But I think the important thing to note here, so this was the last one. They called him Reggie, but short for Reginald. Again, British butler theme, gotta love it. Reggie did not tend to spend time with the other dogs. As near as we could tell, the others did not accept him in their pack structure, didn't like him around, whatever you want to say it was. So Reggie did his own thing, marched to the beat of his own drum. This dog tended to stay with the goat flock on the property. So you can see his activity is in many ways a reflection of what you see with the other dogs. He is intensively in one pasture where the goats are, and he occasionally goes to the other pastures when animals are either moved or when there's lambing or kidding going on that he can assist with. But again, does Reggie leave the property? No, not really, unless you are taking a hard look down on the southwest corner where he did leave for 21 minutes and 9 minutes on two separate occasions. Again, I emphasize, when those animals leave the property, intense data collection, we know where it is or where it was. He left the property in one case and made a small loop and went back on. In the other case, he left the property and made a bigger loop, but in a shorter period of time, and then came back. What was he doing? Was he chasing a predator? I don't know. I can tell you that he was in an area where we did witness coyotes on the property. So perhaps he was out there doing his job, or perhaps he saw something he didn't like and he thought he needed to investigate it. But this was one of the rare times that he actually left the property. Again, long period of time, and we only saw a couple of instances. So as far as the dogs staying inside of the property, it seemed pretty clear to us that whether it was because they knew the animals that they needed to stay with, or because they simply knew the property boundary, they did not tend to leave. To me, that was evidence before any complex analysis that the dogs did what they were intended to do. Now, what about how the predators interacted with where the dogs were? Because remember, we knew where the dogs were and when they were in those places, both at a very fine scale, but also coarsely. Are they in that pasture? Are they not in that pasture? And how long were they there? So one thing that we ended up doing was surveying the property with two methods: cameras as well as collecting scat. So these are methods that are used pretty commonly in wildlife. Predators tend to preferentially deposit scat on roads. It's a territorial marking behavior. And so generally speaking, what we see is that if you're going to look for predators, you will find evidence of them on the roads, even when you don't see them yourself. So we had graduate students walk every single mile of road on that place once a month and pick up the scat. And we also had a number of cameras that were deployed on the property in a grid to provide us information on what predators were seen. So these two modes of collecting data allowed us to get a feel for the predator community and what it was doing. And so again, those cameras may have been placed out like this along roads. And so you may see things like a gray fox walking by, or even this bobcat crossing the road. And they may or may not be leaving scat there, but we have evidence, okay, they were on the property. One thing that I will tell you we learned from all of this, which I still find very, very interesting, is that generally speaking, when we did have coyotes, and we did not have that many, this is one of the few camera photos that we had, coyotes tended to avoid the guardian dogs. We saw at least where the cameras were, and knowing where the dogs were at that time, we know at least at a pasture level, they tended not to go in the pastures that had dogs. If they were on the property, they tended to be in the dog-less pastures. But when they did cross through pastures with dogs, they gave those animals a wide berth. They went way far around the dogs' locations. Again, coyote's not stupid. A 25, 30-pound coyote versus a 120-pound Pyrenees, that's not even a fight. That's just a slaughter. So, okay, that effect of the dog being a dissuasionary tool, the coyote doesn't want to be there. So we did see that on the property. I would also point out to you that we had relatively few times that we saw scat from coyotes on the property. So think about that. We saw them on cameras. We did not get that much scat. What this tells us, or what tells a wildlife scientist, is that coyotes aren't spending enough time on the property to set up territories. They're not there long enough to lay scat down. They are crossing through. Maybe they're checking it out. The dog is there, which means this is not a place I want to be, and they leave. So did we get some scat? Yeah, sure we did, but not very much, and not compared to the camera photos. And this was unique. Most other animals, if we looked at the scat and the cameras, they would give you pretty even estimates of those animals, but not in the case of coyotes. So that tells us there's a different behavior going on for those coyotes. And I'll show you some more graphs of this in a minute, but what I can tell you is that gray fox really weren't affected by the presence of the dogs, as near as we could tell. In fact, we actually saw more gray foxes in the pastures with dogs, but this actually follows the idea of a dog's being a surrogate wolf. Where you have wolves, they tend to kill coyotes, they leave gray foxes alone. Coyotes kill foxes if they can get a hold of them. That's how that interaction works. We did see a slight effect on the bobcats on the property, but not the same that we saw for coyotes. So it appears like coyotes were affected more, bobcats to a lesser extent. We didn't see any evidence from our camera photos that deer and turkeys avoided pastures with dogs, but I will emphasize that was not what we were primarily focused on. So I think there does need to be more work done on the impact of this tool on game animals, just because I've heard reports from both sides. I've heard dogs really mess with my deer hunting and turkey hunting, and I've heard they don't care about the dogs and the dogs don't care about them. So I do think this is something that needs to be investigated more, but we did not necessarily see an awful lot of impact on those animals from the dogs. So what all did we actually find out there? Some of it won't surprise you, and some of it may surprise you. Again, all these photos are from the property, and you saw the coyote one already. So on this property, we saw coyotes, we saw bobcats, we saw raccoons and skunks and ringtails and even badgers. And that fascinates me because it's kind of a rocky part of the state. I think those might be the hardest working badgers in Texas, simply because to dig a den, they had to roll softball-sized stones out of the ground. And so when we did find their den, there was a mound of rocks that looked like a pile of cannonballs from the Civil War, and then a den dug on a fence line, kind of like you'd normally expect to see it. Again, we had lots of these animals in the course of the study. Now, I'll show you what the relative proportions of all of them were on the property, but a couple things I want you to understand. The hill country and the Edwards Plateau of Texas is widely known as the highest density for gray foxes on the planet. Now, again, gray foxes are only in North America, but there are very few places, there may not be any places, the density of gray foxes is naturally higher than it is here. That's just how it is. That, by the way, is the reason that we used to have so many rabies issues with gray foxes. When rabies would get started in them, the animals were dense enough in their populations that it would travel very fast. So in the study, what did we see out there? Well, about a quarter of the time we saw raccoons. That doesn't shock anybody. There's lots of raccoons. And we saw lots of gray foxes. The important thing, I think, in this study is to emphasize that we did not see very many coyotes. They do not tend to spend much time on the property. And we did detect a fair number of bobcats, but more skunks than bobcats, to put that in focus. Now, this is a very good habitat type for bobcats. There's no reason we shouldn't be seeing a whole bunch of them, and yet we only saw 8% of our detections, scat, and cameras were bobcats. So that's not too bad, right? In terms of what I'm worried about with livestock production, we can argue about this, but the reality is these are the effects and the numbers of animals we saw. So what about when we had dogs and didn't have dogs? So this is a chart that looks at the proportions of carnivores detected in pastures with guardian dogs relative to when we didn't have dogs in those pastures, right? So how many more or less percent-wise do we have compared to when we didn't have dogs? So you can see on this, when we did have dogs in the pasture, we had a lot more gray fox and a lot more skunks. That makes sense because coyotes and bobcats both prey pretty heavily on those animals. So on the other side of the coin, we saw fewer badgers, a lot fewer bobcats, a lot fewer coyotes, a lot fewer raccoons, and a lot fewer ringtails. Now, in some of these animals, we didn't see very many of them. You didn't see a lot of ringtails or a lot of badgers. That's pretty normal for this part of the world. There's ringtails out there, you just don't see them much. And badgers are interesting because although they would show up on the cameras, badgers don't tend to lay scat on roads. They actually tend to leave it in middens underground. So they're very clean in that way, right? We still detected them, and there were still fewer in the areas that had dogs versus those that didn't have dogs. Now, again, I'm not saying all of this is because of the dogs. I am saying that this was what we detected in those areas that had dogs versus those that didn't. So it's something to chew on and think about. What are these predators doing in terms of where they're choosing to spend their time? Apparently, a gray fox feels like a pasture with a dog, at least in this case, was safer than one without. And again, I know everybody wants to see this chart, everything on the other side of the coin. The reality is, if I'm cutting down on the activity of coyotes and bobcats, I'm handling a lot of my concerns. So one thing that we did on this in this property that I thought was interesting, we wanted to talk a little bit about what bobcats were doing. Let me explain why. We didn't see very many coyotes, and we didn't have much coyote scat in this project. Otherwise, we would have done the same thing with them. We did have a fair number of bobcat scats. Bobcats are what we call obligate carnivores, meaning that they don't scavenge and they don't eat plant matter. Coyotes are heavy scavengers and they eat a lot of plant matter. They're really more omnivores than anything. Bobcats don't have that option. They have to make live kills and eat fresh meat. So we wanted to see what bobcats were actually eating out there in the presence of dogs. So you have a chart here that basically says the N is literally how many times did we find it, or in how many scats, and frequency of occurrences in the scats we looked at, how frequently did you find this stuff. So what you can see here is that your jackrabbits, which we have more of there, made up a lot of it. Cottontails made up a little bit. Lots of rodents, and boy, we didn't cut down on that, but rabbits and hares and rodents, 84% of the time and 90% of the time, those were present in the bobcat diet, which makes sense. About 18% of the time we saw whitetail in the diet, which makes sense too. Bobcats prey on adult whitetails pretty heavily. But in the livestock category, only once did we ever detect livestock in a bobcat diet, in bobcat scat, and it was from a sheep, not from goats. And I would point that out. We all know predation is a fact of life, and even a good dog can't be 100% effective. And there's a chance that this animal was already dead and the bobcat decided to scavenge. We don't know. We can't say that. But we did detect sheep one time and one time only. We detected more skunks than we did sheep. And boy, I'd love to know why that's a thing. But it's also important to recognize that 15% of the time, bobcats were eating skunks and not other stuff. And then we had some other stuff, birds, insects, reptiles, and then frankly, some stuff we couldn't identify. The way we do this, and this is what the photo is, we pull hair out of the scat. So those nice students of mine take all that poop and they wash it until it's just the solid parts left. Then they put it under a microscope and they identify it. You can look at hair under the microscope and uniquely identify what it is down to species. So that's how they did this. They went through it painstakingly to figure out what those bobcats were actually eating, because in the case of bobcats, it's typically more common that we see live predation rather than scavenging, although bobcats do scavenge at times. So that's a little bit about what the predators did and didn't do when the dogs were out there. Now, one thing I do want to point out as far as how the dogs spend their time with different animals, I told you we had radio transmitters on the livestock as well. And I think that's a really important point of this. So these are what those collars look like. They're just little UHF frequency antennas or transmitters, just like on your old television. You'd switch over the UHF band and you'd select your channel, right? They talk to the dog's collars. So the dog collar is always listening for one of these. And when it detects it, it logs the serial number, and the strength of the frequency or the signal tells it how far away it is from that animal. So we're able to look at the landscape and see how often do you see those livestock and how close do you get. to save you the beleaguering charts and figures and math, what we saw pretty much broadly was that the dogs tend to stay with the flocks. Now, you did see that certain dogs spent more time with either the sheep or the one more with the goats. The reality is, in both cases, those flocks were protected, and the dogs do a pretty good job of making the rounds. And they looked in on most of those animals within 50 yards or less pretty much every day. The thing that people often say to me is, yeah, but I think my dog has favorites. And I have a couple of conflicting views on that. I don't disagree. One thing that we did notice in a time when many of the sheep were removed from the property for shearing, the dogs did not respond all that well, and they started moving greater distances still on the property. I think they were looking for the sheep. With the individual sheep, we saw that there were a handful of sheep or goats that were almost always in close proximity of that dog. But think about it. That dog is always moving. All times of day and night, that dog's moving around. I personally think that those stock really like spending time with that dog, kind of like little roadies or groupies or whatever. They like spending time with that dog, and so they're there with them. We did have a time on the project where a dog died of natural causes. So we went, got the mortality signal from the collar. We investigated. The dog was dead. No signs of predation or foul play or shooting or anything. So we took the dog to the veterinarian. Veterinarian necropsied it and pretty well thought, although I don't know that it was a confirmation that the dog was old already and that it had experienced heart failure. When we found that dog, there were a handful of sheep standing around the carcass. We removed that dog's carcass. We came back, and the sheep were still standing there, waiting for the dog, I think. What ended up happening later that day is as another group came by and another dog with them, those sheep just went with that dog and that other group of sheep. So they were fine. But we have seen this attachment of certain livestock animals to the dog. Don't know why that is, don't know what causes it, but we have seen that. The dogs themselves tend to interact pretty well with one another, but we showed you the example of two dogs that tend to run together. We also showed you the example of dogs that kind of associate but mostly do their own thing, and then dogs that go off and do their own thing entirely. We saw sometimes that they would overlap a little bit more, and sometimes they would bed down near one another at night, but it really just depended. As far as the time of year, really it had a lot to do with ranging of livestock, how far the livestock are moving around and how much they're not, based on heat and weather and other factors. But generally speaking, the dogs stayed with the stock and the stock stayed with the dogs, and they tend to get around one another pretty frequently. We never saw an example of stock that we know are out there and alive, and the dogs never spent any time. When we look at daily activity, and guys, this is an ugly looking chart, just bear with me. The hours of the day from midnight to midnight, right, from 0 onward, and you can see the step length has to do with how much the dogs are moving, right? Basically, the way you interpret this chart, at least for this animal, is that in the nighttime, that dog wasn't moving much at all. During the daytime, the dog moved a little bit more in the morning, and then it declined throughout the day, moving with the livestock. This was what we saw as an example with some of the dogs. Some people say, well, they're very active at night. And those little circles that are above the bars show us outliers. So there were times that the dogs were active at night, although they normally weren't. Maybe those were times the dogs thought they had to get up and move around, but otherwise they weren't moving a whole lot. I would also emphasize that the stock weren't moving a whole lot at night either. And so the dogs were doing their job. This is also something that you can see pretty well from that when we talk about activity cycles. This is another example of what we would see where the dog actually is fairly active 24 hours a day. They take little breaks and naps and siestas where they're either bedded down or they're at water sources with the livestock. But this dog was much more active day and night. Again, not necessarily a reflection of whether or not the dog's doing its job, just a reflection of what it had to do in order to stay with the stock, do what it thought it needed to do. Okay, I have one more ugly egg-headed chart that I'm going to share with you, and it has to do with the discussion of food and water distribution. So I want you to ignore this. This is it's a cross-K analysis is the function. On this property, food and water were put together. So there were dog feeders where there was livestock and dog water. And essentially what we saw in this example is that the farther you got from water and food, the less time the dogs spent there, right? But we never found a limit to which the dogs broke away from the sheep and goats and would not move beyond a certain distance because they were too far from the water. This was just a functional check for us to inform management on the ranch to go, do we have enough of food and water spread out? It appears we do. So I cannot say experimentally what wouldn't be enough because we never backed it down to see at what point we start having problems. That wasn't the goal. This was already working. So we wanted to see, okay, is there a limit to that, or do they tend to do pretty well? My thinking on it is because there was food available at most of the watering sites, as the dogs and the stock were watering, they could also feed pretty effectively. And again, if you have questions about how to design and deploy those feeding stations, boy, talk to Bill Costanzo, because he's fantastic with that stuff and all of his designs on feeders. And I have lots of opinions about dog feeders and issues of non-target animals getting into them, but Bill can address that with you. So guys, this really is a snapshot of the way that good dogs were doing their job and how the predators responded and reflected what those dogs were doing out there. Again, there's a lot more layers of that onion. One day I would love to unpack. And there are some things we just couldn't answer from this study simply because we weren't able to be there before the dogs were working and see the effect of the dogs and then maybe even pull dogs out. That wasn't the question. That wasn't the scenario. In this case, what we wanted to see is how do good dogs do their job and how do the predators respond to good dogs? So Bill, I always think we get lots of questions and I don't know how we're doing on questions, but I wanted to go ahead and stop a little bit early to see how many we had and give us plenty of time to talk through those items because there's a lot of nuance. And guys, this is a photo I particularly enjoy from our time on this project. This is an example of what you get into in a green, nice time of year. The stock are seeking shade. We did this analysis too. How close do the dogs stay to shade? Well, when it's hot, they go to the shade. But let's ground investigate that. So too do the livestock. So this is a good example of what we would see in that environment. And imagine that you're a predator. If I'm moving around checking out livestock, looking for things that are vulnerable, like that little lamb, and then there's a big old wolf that works for a human standing behind it, I think I'm good. I think I'll move on and find a rabbit or a mouse or something else. So, Bill, I'm going to go ahead and I don't have more data slides or anything after this. I'd love to hear and see what questions we've got and see if we can get some answers for folks.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Tomacek. I know we have a couple here. First question was, did you note any differences in feral pig populations?
So that is a really great question. And I want to say this with the caveat of there are pig numbers on this property, and we know there are. Interestingly, on our project, we did not at this time detect all that many pigs. Now, remember, this is a handful of years ago, and the pig numbers in the area have gotten a lot worse. I would love to go back and do this again. We weren't able to detect pigs on those cameras and therefore can't say anything about how they'd respond. But again, one of my lingering questions is what can and can't dogs do with pigs? I think that's something we need to know more about.
The next question actually has to do with proper diet for a livestock guardian dog. So I guess I'll try to address that one real quick. There we do have a video. Dr. Zoran gave a nutrition video for us several months back, and that's on our YouTube channel if you would like to check that out. But basically her recommendation for active working livestock guardian dogs was a protein percentage somewhere around 22% and a fat level of about 17, with animal protein as the first ingredient in whatever type of kibble that you decide to buy for your livestock guardian dog.
The only thing I can contribute, because Bill is the expert there by far, is you must feed your dogs. And I emphasize this to tell you that if you do not feed your dogs, they will find something to eat, and that often causes conflict. So yes, please make sure you have a good feeding program for your dogs. Yes,
I would agree with that. And do try to buy something that's a fairly good quality feed for them. We do have some more questions coming in here. So the next one is, do males tend to wander more or do females wander more? As far as females, males? What seems to be the role that they play, and is there a difference?
So that's a great question. You know, in this study, at least, we had one female and the rest were males, but we didn't really see a big difference between the two. They seem to do pretty much the same things. Again, I'm not going to say it's a small property because I'd love to own so much land, but in terms of sheep country, it's not the biggest part of the world. And those dogs tended to stay well within pastures. So we did not see intense wandering, but the behavior wasn't very much different between the one female and the males. And to my knowledge, these animals were all fixed instead of being intact.
Next question is, what advice do you have regarding sister livestock guardian dogs?
So, Bill, I'm going to assume this is in terms of two siblings.
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, you know, it's a great question. In this case, I did not know anything about the parentage of these dogs. I really don't know much about what litter they came out of and how they may or may not have been related. And at least in terms of this study, we weren't able to assess that. Bill, from your experience raising and working with those dogs, do you have any thoughts there?
Yes, we've had, you know, in the current bonding project that we have going on, we are bonding single dogs from the same litter as a pair of dogs, siblings. The siblings do seem to have a stronger bond to each other than to the livestock. Now, once they're all released out into the pasture, so we had a single and then a pair released in the same pasture with livestock for a certain period of time. It seemed when there was a perceived threat, and it was usually some cattle from ASU's property, the single dog would stay with the herd while the pair would go and bark at those cattle. Now, you can have some issues with, you know, siblings, especially as they get older, if they've been bonded together. And sometimes, you know, you may have to separate them into different pastures as they're going through those kind of teenage months from about, you know, 8 to 10 months of age until they mature about 18 months of age.
Great advice.
Let's see here. We definitely have some more questions.
Good. This is why I did this. I like them percolating up.
What's the best way to train them on your property?
Bill, that's a you question.
Okay. So again, I go back to the bonding project that we have going on. You know, we strongly recommend that you use bonding pens and to place your dogs in bonding pens with some livestock. You know, the same type of livestock that they're going to be with when they get out of the pens. So if you have a mix of sheep and goats, then bond them with sheep and goats. It does seem like the hot wire in the bonding pens decreases the amount of roaming as adults. Now, we've only gone through 3 rounds of dogs, and so it's very early to, you know, make statements that you definitely should use hot wire, but it does seem like the hot wire helps keep them in the pastures they belong in when they're adults. The next question is there only research being done on large acreage plots? Do you have data, or would you be seeking for smaller homestead type farms and livestock guardian dogs use in that setting?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, that's one of those things that, at least right now, most of the opportunities have been on larger properties, simply because that's where the dogs were being employed, because it's tough to manage predation on those large acreages. I tell you what environment I am interested in, which is small acreage holdings, but specifically, I would love to look at small acreage holdings in terms of, I'd love to see what the predators are doing off the property that has the dogs, as well as on the property that has the dogs, right? Because the predators don't really care about fences. They don't know the difference between a perimeter and an interior fence. And I frankly would love to see some data on what happens when we have dogs introduced to an area. They're the only game in town as far as dogs go. Do we see the predators move off? Because it is a smaller plot, whereas here we saw that the predators can skillfully avoid the dogs even in a single pasture. So I don't have data on that, but I do think it's valuable to do in the future.
I'll take the next question again, and feel free to jump in here, Dr. Tomachek. The question was, is there a certain breed that does better in the heat? Not really in our experience. You know, I would encourage you, if you're, you know, in areas that have a lot of heat, like here in Texas, you know, to look for a shorter haired breed, maybe Akbash or Anatolian Shepherd. it'll definitely help them out, you know, in those hotter times.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Next question is, at what age do dogs start doing better with staying with the livestock? Oh, I guess I'll answer some of that, and feel free to jump in based on your research there at the Martin. But, you know, really the dogs need to get to maturity before they settle down. And so that, depending on the dog and the breed, there's some variations, but you're looking at 18 to 24 months of age. Usually by about 18 months, they've settled down fairly well. You'll see some things come up sometimes, again, depending on the dog. Some take a little bit longer to mature than others.
Yeah, and I would emphasize, remember in our study, these dogs were already mature and working. So it's tough for me to comment on that other than, you know, these dogs were older, and that early period seems like a very steep investment. But when you have a good dog that's doing its job and it does it for many years, that investment pays off in the long run.
Okay, so next question is, what is the proper age for a dog to go out to pasture with a herd, adding a puppy to additional dogs? So, you know, all of our pups go through the bonding process. We end up placing them with cooperating producers anywhere from 8 to 10 months of age. Again, it kind of depends on the maturity of the dog and the overall size of the dog. But that's about the age that we send dogs out to cooperating producers. That they do have to be large enough to, you know, to handle whatever sort of threat that you have. And so if you had, you know, just smaller threats, then, you know, a younger dog can go out. If you have larger threats like lions, then you should definitely probably wait for a more mature dog. Gosh, Dr. Tomachek, they're asking me all these questions again.
Well, I see that. I opened up the chat window, Bill. It is up to you how you want to handle it. There are a couple of more wildlife related questions. I also noticed that Dr. Redden didn't mention everybody, guys. We've got a fact sheet that was written on how to bond livestock guardian dogs to livestock. And Bill, I think y'all have some videos too on bonding pens and such. And guys, those are wonderful resources that I emphasize you can really sit there and percolate on them and digest them slowly.
Let's try to get some more of your questions here.
Sure.
If we've got any here.
Well, let's see. I see that one person's been having issues raising chickens as a hobby and lost a bunch of bobcats, raccoons, and coyotes. Yeah, you bet. That's always a problem. And with chickens, what I tell everybody is, you know, coops are your best friend, but even then, it's a lot of maintenance because you have to keep those animals out of the coop, and boy, they're good at figuring it out. I would love to know more about how your dog helps with that, frankly, just because I've never looked at the interaction of poultry pens to guardian dogs. I see Ashley O'Connor's asking about guard dogs in Puma country. You know, it's interesting. I will tell you, on this property, at one point in time, somebody had seen a mountain lion, but we did not detect any in our study. I have not personally done any work with dogs in country that had lions, but I would love to, just because working into those apex predators, I'd like to see the interaction. I will tell you, the interactions between gray wolves and pumas or mountain lions tends to be one where the cats tend to avoid the wolves more than the other way around. And so I'm curious how the guarding dogs would do. You know, I would emphasize for those kind of things, one of my colleagues at Utah State University, Julie Young, has done quite a lot of guardian dog work in that western part of the world, and some of her data may be more relevant to that. Bill, I'm not trying to steal the hosting from you. I'm just
no. Feel free. So, I mean, the next question is, let's see. Is there a way to encourage your dog to drive away a specific type of predator? They have an issue with raccoons there.
You know, that's a great question. I've never been around somebody that trained their guardian dog to be an attack dog. My experience is the dogs tend to do a pretty good job of being dissuasive. And as far as what they do, the interactions between predators and dogs are not usually an attack. Usually it's more of a, I'm big and I'm here and you need to go away. As far as dealing with raccoons, I've never known anybody to train a dog to deal with a certain kind of predator, although I imagine there's a way to do that if you're a person who's a dog trainer, which I'm not.
Next question. I'm actually kind of curious about this myself. Have you done any research comparing like donkeys and llamas compared with livestock guardian dogs?
Yeah, it's interesting. People ask me this all the time. I've never done direct research with them. My experience is that I'm looking at dogs as a surrogate for a natural apex predator, being a wolf, and I'm expecting the other native wildlife to understand that. There's nothing in the wild that would behave like a guardian llama or guardian donkey, so that's a little bit different. I will tell you that one of the issues of managing guardian donkeys, at least, is that they tend to have more affinity for one another than for the stock. Or if you have horses in the same pasture, they're going to go hang out with the horses instead of your sheep or goats. And so bear that in mind. They all have their ups and downs. Some people say, well, there's no way that a donkey or a llama would kill my livestock, and sometimes a young dog will kill stock. That's not true. Donkeys and llamas can do the same thing. And I've watched a donkey pick up a lamb and crush the back of its head and throw it away. It's, again, just management of those animals. Sorry, I just saw Ashley's comment pop up. Yeah, Ashley, I agree. The areas in Florida that have got Florida Panthers, guardian dogs would be really, really interesting there, because that cattle production and those cattle raisers are used to interacting with the Florida Panthers. And what's fascinating, guys, if you're not aware, coyotes weren't a thing in southern Florida until the 1980s. So although they're used to the presence of those lions or panthers, coyotes are really a relatively new issue for them.
Let's see. I can tell you, if anybody is here that's also raising cattle and they're interested in livestock guardian dogs, Dan Macon out in California right now is bonding some puppies to cattle. And he does have a blog that you can sign up for. And he's a extension agent with the University of California, Davis. Let's see, one of the next questions, let's see, when our flock goes near the road and vehicle occasionally pass by, our guardian dogs develop a habit of chasing after these vehicles. How should we intervene? Afraid one of the dogs is going to get hit. Boy, I mean, other than setting up, some hot wire or an invisible fence type of system that'll shock the dogs when they come up to the fence line, that's about all the advice that I think I could probably give you on that question. Do you have a link by any chance, Dr. Tomachek, on any research about pumas or lions or any of that kind of stuff?
Not offhand, but I can get you a link to some of that and have you send it out.
Okay, so the next question was about the cattle research. His name is Dan Macon, and he works as an extension agent out of the UC Davis University there in California. And the last question, I guess I'll go ahead and answer this one. There's a second one. How long should you keep your dogs in the bonding pens? We start out with 8-week-old pups. They go into a 60 by 60 enclosure with 4 to 6 head of livestock. They spend a month there. Then they go into a 1-acre pen that's attached to that, and they stay there until 6 months of age. And then at 6 months, we release all the dogs into a larger pasture, and then we track them in that pasture until they're about 8 to 10 months of age, and then they head out to cooperating producers. Does anyone else have any other questions for Dr. Tomachek today?
I'm going to go ahead and
well, we have, let's see here. Okay, I think we're probably pretty close on ending here. Any other questions? What's the recommendation for number of livestock guardian dogs per acre or head of stock?
You want to take that one, Bill?
I guess I'll take that one again. We generally recommend, 1 to 2 dogs per 100 head. And that really depends on, your the size of your ranch, amount of predators, the type of predators, how much brush. There's a whole bunch of things that come into play there. The type of stock also, Dorpers tend to spread out a lot more than some of your wool sheep. So basically start with 1 to 2 dogs and kind of adjust from there.
Hey, Bill, I'd like to add to that one.
Yeah,
we
feel
get that
free.
question a lot, and I tried to answer it at a meeting one time, and then a longtime livestock guard dog user by the name of Bob Rick came back with a very simple response. Start with a couple dogs and keep adding dogs until the predation stops, and then you got there.
There you go. There you go.
That's good advice, because you don't want to start with too many in the beginning, because they can be a headache, and it's something that people can use.
And I will say, guys, remember, if you have questions that percolate up later, if it's related to the management of the dogs themselves, boy, the shop there in San Angelo, what Dr. Redden and what Bill are doing is just fantastic. A lot of resources. If you have questions about any of my work or the wildlife side of things later, I'm easy to find. You can Google me and you'll get my phone number and my email address and everything else. So do not hesitate to send questions along. We're here for you.
Well, again, thank you, Dr. Tomachek. I really appreciate you coming and presenting again for us on such a great topic. I do want to just thank the Sheep and Goat Predator Management Board again, Dr. Redden, our Center Director, and Robert Pritz, and also our sponsor, Lone Star Tracking. If you guys have any other questions that come up, feel free to contact me, and I can pass you on to Dr. Tomachek if you can't find his information. And with that, check back with us. Our next webinar will be in February. And we'll be going over the livestock guardian dog bonding project that we have going on.
Very good. Thanks, y'all, for having me.
Yep. Thank you again, Dr. Tomachek, and everyone have a good Thanksgiving. Thank you.